Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Sony FE 20-70mm f4G lens. Now, I recognize that I'm probably a couple of months late at this point after this lens has been released, just due to scheduling quirks. I couldn't fit it in at the time, but I've been spending some quality time with this lens over the last several weeks, including taking it with me on a trip to Cancun, Mexico area, and it has proved to be an excellent travel companion for that. And so I thought that that would be a great kind of a segue for this particular review and at this particular time. It was actually in the briefing for this lens that a Sony rep mentioned the fact that something that kind of resonated with me, and that was that modern cameras, for example, I've got this mounted on the Sony a7R Mark V, which I've used primarily for this test. That's 61 megapixels. When you got 61 megapixels, you have a lot of options for cropping, which of course gets you closer to the subject. But what high resolution doesn't solve is the ability to get wider. And so it becomes increasingly important in this day of increasingly common high resolution bodies to have lenses that can go wide enough, because that gives you more flexibility. So essentially this lens takes the standard zoom kind of standard ratio of 24-70 millimeters, and while 4 millimeters doesn't sound like a lot on paper, it really dramatically changes what you can do with the lens going from 24 to 20 millimeters. For example, at 20 millimeters, you can get this much of the scene in, and at 24 millimeters, you get this much. And if you go into an interior space, obviously by comparison, you can get much more in the frame. So essentially what it does is it kind of blends both a wide angle zoom with a standard zoom into one lens. And for many people, 20 millimeters is going to be wide enough to basically serve pretty much all of their wide angle needs. And so if you paired this lens, for example, with the new 70-200 f4 Macro G, you have an incredible optical performance all the way from 20 to 200 millimeters at a very compact size and weight, which makes this a very attractive combination. Now, a maximum aperture of f4 and a standard zoom is probably not going to excite anyone too much, but I think depending on your photography style, this lens is going to work perfectly fine for your needs. So who is this lens best suited for? Find out with me as we explore it after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So as noted, we do have a compact size here. This lens is very reasonable in terms of its size, and it is just a little bit bigger and heavier than the older Zeiss 24-70 millimeter f4. However, it goes considerably wider. 24 versus 20 millimeters is a radical difference, particularly when it comes to engineering for wide angle and then to a longer focal length. Tamron, for example, has a 20-40 millimeter zoom, and I think that that zoom is very intriguing. But 40 millimeters limit, there's an extra 30 millimeters here to work with. So obviously you're going to be able to do a lot of different things with this lens that you can't do with the Tamron. And so overall, I think that the size is really reasonable for what we've got here. It is 78.7 millimeters in diameter, giving you a 72 millimeter front filter thread. I don't love 72 millimeters because it's not as common as either 67 millimeters or 77 millimeters, but there are a number of lenses that do share that filter size. The lens is 99 millimeters in length, and so that's 3.1 inches by 3.9 inches, and it weighs in at 488 grams or 17.2 ounces. So you've got under 500 gram weight, means this is easy to carry around. I did a lot of just carrying it around as a part of my travels. I had zero issues with that. The overall combination is still really, really lightweight. Now, this is an externally zooming lens, as you can see here. The zoom action is really, really good. Very, very well damped, very smooth. There's no wobble or anything. And there is no kind of tendency towards zoom creep, which is good because there actually isn't a zoom lock, which is kind of surprising when you don't have an internally zooming lens. So about 4 centimeters of barrel extension there at 70 millimeters. It does have a variety of features. I found that Sony's lenses have become increasingly more feature-rich, and that's definitely true here. It starts with a lot of ways to control aperture. You have the ability to use an aperture ring, and you can use it with clicks, with 1/3 stop detents throughout. And those detents are actually quite strong. It's very definite. You're going to feel those a little bit, maybe almost too much. But there is a declick option. So that gives you the option to kind of smoothly go throughout the various aperture options. And also for video, allows you to do aperture racking, which could be an essential part of your video capture. You also obviously have the ability to lock it into an A or automatic mode if you don't like using an aperture, aperture ring. And there is an iris lock on the left side of the lens that allows you to either lock it into the manual aperture ring or lock it out of the manual aperture ring, depending on kind of your preference. If you don't like a manual aperture ring at all, no problem. Just use that aperture lock and you're never going to have to worry about inadvertently choosing aperture through the manual aperture ring. I only have one complaint about the execution of that, and that is the declick option. It is down on the right side and it's quite low, and so what happens is that the grip of the camera actually interferes with getting at it. It's in a really kind of difficult position ergonomically, so I don't love that execution, though obviously at the same time this is not a switch you're going to be reaching for constantly either. Other features include an AF/MF switch and along with 2 focus hold buttons. Now those are redundant, as you know, anytime you have more than one focus hold button, the purpose of it is to allow you to access it when you're shooting in a different orientations, you know, portrait orientation versus landscape orientation. The function of that focus hold button can be programmed through the camera body itself, and so you can choose a wide variety of different functions. Just gives you another control point on the lens itself. I will also point out that we have a very thorough weather sealing here. There's about 14 seal points as I count in this diagram. Fluorine coating on the front. Traveling to Mexico where it is very hot and humid, that was a very handy thing because you come out of an air-conditioned facility, immediately everything fogs up, and so you know there's that option of moisture buildup that a weather sealing design is going to keep out of that. Also, the fluorine coating did help out. You have to kind of wait a few minutes for everything to equalize, but I could speed up the process a little bit because this was so easy to wipe due to that fluorine coating, and so I could start to get into my photography more quickly, particularly in the morning where you're wanting to get those crucial early morning light shots, and so I appreciated that. Another interesting thing here is that we do have a really low minimum focus distance of just 25 centimeters, and that gives you a very high 0.39 times magnification, which is a very high magnification. Now you're close enough that it's not a completely flat plane of focus, as you can see here, but I will also point out that it allowed me to get really close and produce interesting results, not just for photos, but also, as you can see here, for videos as well. So there's a lot of versatility that's built into this lens, and it handles very, very nicely. It's a nice size, just very functional in real world use, particularly for travel, which I think is a really important application for a lens like this. Now, when it comes to autofocus, we have dual XD. That's their higher powered, higher torque linear motors here. And so as a byproduct of that, as I think is true of basically all of Sony's new releases, at least higher end lens releases, autofocus is pretty much perfect. It is fast, it is accurate, it is very quiet in operation. It was quick enough to capture bird in flight, and kind of crucially in these moments where I wasn't really thinking about shooting bird in flight, I was out shooting landscape, and so my shutter speed wasn't really fast enough, and I was just kind of adjusting to just something that happened. A pelican came swooping in, decided he was going to knock a seagull off of his perch, so I managed to just kind of point the camera and get the shots. They're well focused, and even though my shutter speed was technically too low, I kind of like the effect of the shutter dragging there, and it made for an interesting effect. But most importantly, when it comes to autofocus, even in that kind of snap situation, autofocus was quick enough and accurate enough to nail it and get what I wanted in that situation. I found, of course, that IAF was pretty much flawless, whether I was shooting human subjects, various animal subjects, this boa constrictor in Mexico, shooting insects like my bees, zero issue with any of those things. Autofocus was just perfectly reliable, no issues at all to complain about. On the video front, again, as I've come to expect, I have no complaints there either. Focus pulls were smooth and confident, and beyond that, you'll also see that there is a minimum of focus breathing here. And my hand test also, I had no problems with that. Nice, quick, confident transition from my hand to my eye and vice versa. So autofocus is highly recommended here. So how about image quality? Sony has, stretched the boundaries a little bit by going this wide in a standard zoom. And so that does come with some engineering challenges. And we're going to see that they were able to overcome those quite successfully, though there is one little thing that gets masked by the correction profile that is there that we'll highlight here as a part of this section. But let's dive in and let's take a closer look at how this lens holds up on a high resolution body.
So the first thing we'll jump to is what is really, if there's any kind of flaw to this lens, it is this. At 20 millimeters, there is some significant barrel distortion. Now, that's not unusual in my experience when they try to push the boundaries. A manufacturer tries to push the boundaries in how wide they're going to go in a compact lens. And so this is what gives right here. Now, I'll jump ahead for just a moment to the correction profile here on the right, and that is the actual profile. So you can see that there's a little bit of bulge that remains, but it corrects it fairly well. If you try to manually correct, as I've done here on the left, we have it's not just a lot of distortion, it's also an inconsistent. So you can see there's a dip up and down, what's often called a mustache pattern. You can see the amount of distortion is actually really high. At a plus 50, this is one of the higher levels of distortion that I've actually had to correct in a lens like this. So there's a lot there. Vignetting is very, very light, and so vignette is basically a non-issue, but the distortion obviously is not something you're going to want to manually correct. Fortunately, the profile does a fairly good job with it. At the same time, however, I wouldn't call this my top choice for doing interiors, for the simple reason that when you're having to correct a lot of distortion, there is a little bit of price to pay, and that your lines are just not going to be as clean as what they would be in a lens that does just a little bit better in this regard. Now, for more typical shots like this, not interiors, but where there are other straight lines, I don't see any problem here. I think the correction profile has cleaned everything up to where I wouldn't look at this image and see any kind of issue there. Everything looks nice and clean. So probably not much of a real-world issue for most shooters. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we switch towards a pincushion type distortion, and it's not insignificant. There is some here. It's about a -9 to correct for that. But you can also see in my manual correction, it is a very linear, it's easy to correct for, and obviously the profile is going to clean it right up. Vignette continues to be extremely, extremely low. You're just really not going to have to worry about vignette correction very much. This is only about a plus 20 in terms of correction once again, which is about as minimal as I ever see. So how about our sharpness and contrast here? So once again, we have a 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V body here, and I'm showing you these results at 200%. At 200% in the middle of the frame, this is flawless. That is superbly sharp, very high detail and contrast, just fantastic. If we move off towards the mid-frame, likewise, mid-frame looks exceptionally good. I mean, that is just great. Panning down here, continues to look great. And it's really only as we get towards the corner that we see just a bit of a drop-off. It doesn't look as good on either one of those sides right out near the corner. Now, I will point out, we just saw that there is a lot of distortion that has to get corrected. One of the potential costs of that is that maybe we're losing just a little bit of sharpness in that correction process, because the MTF suggests that the lens probably should be a little bit sharper than this in real life. So here in a real world shot at f5.6, we can look at those corners. We can see that, in real world use, they really don't look all that bad. You can see right there at the edge, it does drop off a little bit, but overall, I would say that that is a perfectly useful looking image. And of course, in the center of the frame, it's deadly sharp. Looks really fantastic. Now, stopping down from f4 to f5.6, we can see there is, in the center of the frame, it's hard to say that it's any sharper. It was already just so exceptionally good. I would say here you can see that there's just still more detail. Look at the lips here, that there's just more showing their higher contrast there. Down in this corner, you can see that there is some improvement that is coming to the corners. If we pop over to this side, we can see, it just looks brilliantly sharp out at this point. And if I go all the way up into this upper left corner here, we can see that there is some improvement, still not as good as anywhere else in the frame, but it's only at that last little bit where we start to lose a little bit of image quality. Now our peak corner performance is going to come here at f8, where it's just a little bit sharper. If we look here, you can see we're not any improved in the mid frame. If anything, there's just a very, very mild regression back, and the same is going to be true in the center of the frame. But if your priority is getting as sharp of results all across the frame, kind of the most even sharpness, f8 seems to be the peak aperture here. Now our minimum aperture is f22, but after f8 you're going to see a steady erosion due to diffraction on high resolution bodies, and so, well, on all bodies, but in particular on high resolution bodies. And you can see here that there is a huge difference between f4 and f22 in terms of the sharpness and contrast, and that's just due to diffraction. So if we go from 20 millimeters to 24 millimeters, we can see that in the center of the frame, both are just stunningly sharp. I mean, that's incredibly, incredibly good. Mid-frame is about equal, but I would give a very slight edge to 24 millimeters. And if I look over on this side, that just feels a little crisper to me than what I saw at 20 millimeters. Likewise, down here in the corner, you can see that it's just a little bit sharper, a little bit better detail there in the corner. Likewise, on this side, you can see a fairly noticeable difference. So 24 millimeters is sharper still. So moving on from 24 millimeters to 35 millimeters, we see that consistently just really, really amazingly sharp center frame. Also mid-frame looks about equal here. If we move over to this left side, again, looking roughly the same, and up into this corner here, we can see that I would say that 24 millimeters is perhaps ever so bit slightly better than what 35 millimeters is, but overall really, really consistent in terms of performance. Now comparing 35 millimeters with 50 millimeters, we can see that it remains just brilliantly sharp in the center of the frame. I would say like a percentage point or two less, but still very, very close. Mid-frame looks really, really good in both spots. And down here in the corner, we can see that they look roughly the same, perhaps a little bit of an edge for 50 millimeters on that side, and they look about the same here over on the left side. Now with mini zoom lenses, they are actually weakest at, one of the ends of it, in many cases at the telephoto end. That's really not the case here. You can see comparing 50 millimeters and 70 millimeters. 70 millimeters still looks brilliantly good. Mid-frame looks really, really good, better still than what we saw at 50 millimeters. Here on the left side, we can see it looks fantastic, very, very crisp. And even right up into the corner, we can see that it's noticeably improved. So this is definitely our most even and consistent sharpness profile that I've seen thus far. Really, really high performing, and it just looks fantastic at 70 millimeters. Everywhere I look in the frame is just fabulous. So we saw that our maximum magnification is quite high, even though you can see that the plane of focus at this close of focus distance is not all that flat. But for real-world shots, you're able to achieve nice, crisp results here. You can see there's a nice detail up close. Plane of focus is very, very narrow. The plane of focus is very, very narrow, as you can see, but where we're focused at, you can see that the sharpness is really, really quite good. And so it can produce some really nice looking images with fairly blurred out backgrounds. Here's another shot looking kind of at the bokeh quality here. And so obviously in this case, there's lots of detail. I mean, if you look at the detail that's on this can that washed up overnight, you can see that it looks really, really crisp. As we look towards the defocused area, there's a little bit of busyness here on this transition zone. Out here looks fairly nice, but again, this is not the kind of lens that typically people are going to use to kind of try to obliterate backgrounds, not really its strength. It really is better at keeping a lot of things in focus. But as you can see here, once again, if we look at this B, the detail is really, really nice in what I've been able to get. And as we look towards the defocus, it looks pretty decent. This lens proved capable of capturing really, really lovely looking colors. And so obviously this is a really color-rich environment here, really nice lighting in the morning, and very rich green grasses. And then of course the thatch there. It all looks really, really good. In this image, which we've already seen, colors are a little bit less extreme, but you can see that they look really, really nice, very natural. Here in a early morning shot, still a little bit of a haze on the lens from the moisture outside, but it produced kind of an interesting looking image that I liked. But particularly the colors itself look really, really rich, and so I really appreciated that. Here's another shot that I liked. There was just a building that had little cutouts in it, and so I saw this framing just while walking and thought, oh, I've got to capture that shot with that lighting as it hit that palm tree. So anyway, you can see just really, really nice color work. Now, when it comes to flare resistance, in many situations, flare resistance was quite good at wider apertures. As you can see here, there's lots of light flooding into the scene, and it's also, magnified by skimming across the ocean and reflecting there. No issues with flare. I mean, I think there might be a tiny little ghosting artifact here, but really nothing much. When stopped down a little bit, you can see the sunburst effect, which is okay, not exceptional, but it works. I saw just a little bit, and as you can see, if we pan across at f11, going down to smaller apertures, you'll see just a little bit more ghosting artifacts, but overall, flare resistance is really quite good.
So as you can see, overall, outside of that strong barrel distortion at 20 millimeters, which by the way is not wholly unexpected, we have a really strong optical performance. I think that maybe that barrel distortion does affect the corners a little bit at some of the wider focal lengths, but overall, we really have exceptionally good image quality here, and images, real world images just look fantastic. Great color, great contrast and pop. They just produce great options. That makes this a really appealing travel option. I've traveled with a 24 to 70 millimeter before and I found that I had packed along a telephoto option, and I just rarely pulled it out because that was long enough to get most of the shots. And of course, these days, if you're on a higher resolution body, the ability to go into an APS-C type crop and to get out over a 100 millimeter equivalent, just makes that really, really useful. And so I think that this is going to cover a lot of those applications, and the ability to go wider. That's the one thing you can't zoom with your feet often when you need to get into a wider space and interior spaces. I wouldn't recommend this for real estate in that higher distortion at that point. I think that there's better options, but for most other applications, this is a great lens. It'd be very useful for wedding and portrait photographers, for giving you some framing options, particularly with groups when you're not so concerned about just blowing out the background and you need more depth of field. So obviously f4 is not going to crush backgrounds, and that's the one thing that will separate this lens as not being great for those that would be better served with maybe an f2.8 type zoom. But if your photography style is more about getting a lot in focus, this is an amazingly useful focal range here, and it delivers excellent image quality all throughout for both photos and video, making this a very, very useful and very recommended lens. And at a price point of right under $1,100 US, that's not cheap, obviously, but neither is it extremely expensive. And when you compare it to a lot of the competition out on the market from other brands, I think that you have a very fair price point for what you're getting here. Because this lens, in many ways, is fairly unprecedented in having this kind of range in a lens like this. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can check out my full text review, which is linked to in the description below, along with an image gallery if you want to look at more photos. There is also some buying links there if you'd like to purchase one, options to follow myself on social media, to become a patron, to get channel merchandise. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.